So this session is about authorization, passkeys, authenticated you, and then what? What can you or cannot do? And hopefully this session will give you some indications how to address this question. And we have the first speaker here from Axiomatics. So I'm not going to introduce your background because I will not do you a favor. Introduce yourself first and what you do, please.
Sure. Okay. So, hey everyone. My name is David. I'm from a company called Axiomatics. I would like to claim we are the leaders in fine-grained authorization, but the panel after this presentation might argue it's not true. But I'm first, so I can always claim it, right? So let me get the clicker. I've been in the authorization space for, 15 years, I think. It's been a while. So I'm happy to be here, happy to be crashing an authentication party as well. It's my first time at Authenticate. I was trying to find a title that would fit on the slide. I had a much longer version somewhere. We made it smaller. Anyway, so I'm going to start with a little story. Does everyone know what this is? It is not a mouse. A rat. Yeah. What do rats have to do with authorization? They get in everywhere they want to go, right? I was listening to a radio program the other day called This American Life from Chicago. Some of you might know the show. And they were talking about rats and how it's a problem in New York City. And then they went to different places and so forth. And then they went to Alberta. So Pam here is from Alberta. And did you know that in Alberta, they don't have rats? Now, I don't know if you guys have looked at a map of Canada or Alberta, but Alberta is like 3 times Germany, 16 times the Netherlands, which granted is not all that hard. But they don't have rats. And in the program, they explained that the way they do it is, they looked at the borders and they figured the northern border of Alberta, you don't have to worry because it's too cold for rats. The western border of Alberta is all mountains. You don't have to worry about rats. They don't go through mountains, apparently. The southern border, well, it's the states. Apparently, they don't have rats in that part of the states, which is really weird, and maybe rats don't have passports to go through the border anyway. So then you're left with the eastern border, which is Saskatchewan, which is full of grain and rat-friendly stuff. And they literally have a police that hunts the rats down that come through that border. It's not a joke. And if you Google Alberta rats, you'll find a government website about what you're supposed to do if you find rats in Alberta. So that's real serious access control, making sure you keep the rats out. Bottom line, we know who you are. The question is, what can you do, right? We know, well, I'm not going to say we're not rats, we're people. Or like if you saw Andrew's presentation this morning from GM, he was saying that there's user identities, there's machine identities, there's process identities, so there's more and more different kinds of identities. But we essentially know what you are. We just want to figure out what it is you want to do. And historically, you could pretty much do anything you could do. You authenticate, you're in, you could roam around the enterprise and get access to whatever piece of information. To solve that, in the IAM pyramid, once we built that solid foundation of authentication, we added governance on top to figure out what permissions people could have and to do things like recertification and all the sort of stuff that the likes of SailPoint do really well. And somehow that top tier kind of floated in the middle without the middle authorization tier. And that's where a bunch of us come in, standards committees and companies, to try and address the authorization piece. Oh, there we go. Let me go back. And I'm missing a slide. Okay, so in authentication, we have a bunch of standards. On the panel after this presentation, we'll talk about that. In authorization, we also have a long series of standards going all the way back to 2001 with ZACWL and then more recently Auth-Zen. I'm not going to delve on that because the panel will touch on the topic in a few minutes. Why does it matter? Why does authorization matter? And more specifically, why does externalized authorization matter? Because you could argue that authorization has been handled by apps forever. You have code in your app that says what can or can't happen. So why now? Why are we saying, well, having code in the app is not good enough anymore? Why do we want to externalize it? Why do we want to make it visible? For 2 main reasons. And historically, I'd like to point out that it's mainly for one reason. It's really for security and compliance and auditability. If you go back to 2001 and the time of ZACWL, and if you look at all the work that's been done since then, a lot of the focus is on the security aspect. Things like GDPR, or things like export control legislation in a manufacturing scenario, or things like HIPAA legislation in a healthcare scenario, right? The point is, if you implement authorization in your app, you don't have visibility of what it does, and then when you turn around and you want to talk to the auditor and say, hey, I'm compliant with this and that, you can't really do that unless you print out some Java that the auditor cannot understand. So that's one of the main drivers for externalizing authorization and expressing it as some form of configuration in a system, be it a centralized system or a decentralized system, as long as it's decoupled from the app. But more recently, we've also seen that it's useful for developers. And there's a bunch of startups, Cerbos, Asserto, Signal, that popped up in the past 5 years, I want to say, that focus a whole lot more on the developer experience than just the traditional authorization vendors. So these are the two reasons. And when I say developer experience, what I mean is, if you can give developers a means to implement authorization, like we have given developers a means to implement authentication or user management, then they're going to be able to develop apps so much more quickly and more consistently. So you're not going to have authorization silos anymore. You're not going to have security gaps. You're going to be in a much better position, right? So that's why externalized authorization matters. Okay. So given we're at an authentication conference, you might argue, hey, hang on a minute, OAuth already does authorization. And if you look at Ian Glazer's presentation this morning, he did mention that in the runtime authorization bucket, you have things like OAuth and OpenID Connect. So show of hands, who here thinks that OAuth is plenty enough? I won't shame you, it's okay. No one, good. Wait, Pam, you think it's enough? Just a little? The problem with OAuth is it tends to hide the authorization flow. It gives you a good foundation to hook in fine-grained authorization, but it tends to be what I call identity-centric. Essentially, of course, you use OAuth for access delegation, like I want to give Facebook access to my Twitter account. I think it's called Twitter, I'm not too sure. But then Facebook can do everything on my Twitter account, right? There's very, very, very coarse-grained or poor-grained access control on that relationship. And that's okay because OAuth is really about access delegation, not so much the fine-grained access. Here's an example from a conference that I attended a few months ago where they were using FileStack to connect to my Google Drive to pick up my presentation to put it in their whatever service they were using. And to do that, I literally had to give FileStack access to all my files, including all my vacation pictures and stuff I don't want to share with a conference. So OAuth is not enough. It's a great start because it gives you that foundation, and it can also give you a hook to put authorization in there and make it evolve into fine-grained authorization, but OAuth on its own is not enough. Now, if you take a crash course in authorization history, you want to distinguish between standards and models. So you might have heard of things like MAC and DAC, mandatory access control, discretionary access control. It dates back to the 70s and the research done by DoD at the time. And then you move into access control lists, still very much identity-centric. You have a name on a list and a permission. It is sort of, by the way, what Google Drive does today. You have RBAC, role-based access control, formalized by NIST in 1992. RBAC is very much about saying, oh my God, so many users, so many permissions, let's group them under roles, under labels to simplify the management of authorization. Move over to 2007, if I remember correctly, with REBAC, relationship-based access control, acknowledging the fact that some of the authorization you have might be driven by the relationship between the item you want to get access to and who you are. And I like to say there's two different kinds of relationships, indirect ones and direct ones. So a direct one would be ownership. I can view this document because I own the document. An indirect one would be, I can view this document because I'm in the same department as the document. And then fast forward to 2013, you have ABAC, also formalized by NIST. The reason I say this is there's a lot of buzz sometimes in vendor land, and one vendor might claim RBAC or ABAC or PBAC or whatever. If you want to go to a nice source of truth, NIST is a good place to go. All right, so if you look in the top layer, you'll see a bunch of standards. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's plenty. I think the point is to show you there's a lot of work happening in the authorization space. And then on the panel, we'll be talking more about AuthZen, the OpenID working group. One other thing I do want to call out, though, is we want to work more. So when I say we, I'm a policy guy. So we, the policy guy, we want to work more in relation to or in collaboration with the OAuth guy. And there's this idea that in auth-zen that there's two different patterns, the token-based authorization pattern and the policy-based or the graph-based authorization pattern. And we want to merge the two together. We want to bridge the two together. They're not exclusive. So 2 ways you can enforce authorization. Ian touched on that this morning. There's admin time authorization, or what I sometimes call birthrights. So as you log in, I'm going to give you a token. I'm going to give you entitlements in that token. I'm going to give you scopes and claims inside of that token. And then it's going to be valid for the lifetime of the token. Or you could do runtime authorization, which is as I'm trying to do something right there and then, I'm going to check whether I have access. Needless to say that I prefer the runtime piece instead of the admin time. So the issue with admin time authorization is usually you can't use context. You cannot use risk factors. You cannot use time of the day. You cannot use device strength, things like that, right? It's also very static. I get a token. It's valid for a whole hour or a whole day, right? There are standards out there like CAPE and RISC that try to address that, but largely today, tokens are pretty static. They're also hard to configure. What claims do you want to insert in a token? How? Why? Right? So that makes setting up OAuth, or by the way, I say OAuth, it's true of SAML as well in the olden days, for those of you who know SAML. It's still not dead. It is still not dead. Someone was telling me over lunch they were having issues connecting 2 IDPs together because of SAML. And then, of course, it kind of fails on the modern authorization use cases where relationships matter a whole lot more. So by contrast, what does runtime authorization provide? Well, number one, it's real time. If you read Zero Trust, you've all heard the word Zero Trust, of course. They say never trust, always verify. So every time you do an action, you want to do real time, runtime, continuous access, enforcement of the access. You also want to do things like dynamic segregation of duty. So to give you an example, static segregation of duty would be you can be a purchase order creator or purchaser, and you could also be separately, not at the same time, an approver, right? So you have 2 roles. You cannot assign the same 2 roles to the same person, so that's static segregation of duty. But we had a customer many years ago that had a trainee, how did it work? A trainee approver role. And the purchaser, as a career path, could become an approver, and so they could have the trainee approver role. So you could have trainee approver and purchaser at the same time together. In a static environment, that leads to trouble because suddenly you can approve your own stuff. With a policy, however, or with dynamic authorization, not role-based, you could say things like, yep, you can approve as a whole, yep, you can create purchase orders as a whole, but no, you cannot approve a PO that you created yourself. That's dynamic SOD. And then, of course, it leads to principle of least privilege. You shouldn't give entitlements from the get-go. Every single time you should verify whether you're supposed to do something, and that can change depending on context, depending on your attributes, depending on what project you're in, so on and so forth. This, if there's one picture you want to remember, this is it. This is straight from the NIST ABAC paper. It is also straight from the Zackwell architecture from 2001. We have a similar picture in the panel coming up. This is what we sometimes call the P*P architecture, right? So you might hear me say, oh, there's the P*P pattern, there's the token pattern. So in token land and OAuth land, you have the AS/RS authorization server, resource server. In ABAC, you have PEP, PDP, PIP, so on and so forth. So the PEP, the enforcement point, is the piece that is responsible for protecting whatever it is you want to protect. Your homegrown app, your API, your Salesforce, your Workday, whatever it might be. The PDP is the brains of the operation. It is what runs the policies, receives the authorization requests, and produces a decision. Either yes, access is allowed, or no, access is denied, right? And then the PIP is where you get the contextual information, the metadata to make your decision. Is the user a manager? Is the user located in I don't know, Canada or the United States, so on and so forth. It can be resource data. It doesn't have to be just identity data. And then the PAP, the administration point, is the interface through which you write your configuration. Now, I say configuration because I like to be nice to my peers in the industry, but when I say configuration, what I really mean is policy. Although it's not always policy, it could be graph, or it could be other ways of configuring authorization. So speaking of policies, In ABAC land, we think of attributes and policies. So ABAC, attribute-based access control, everything is an attribute, not just a role, not just a group. And it can be attributes of the user, identity metadata, but it could also be attributes of the resource, the sensitivity or the classification of a document, the department it belongs to, the location it's in, the amount of a transaction. All this is valid metadata on a resource you want to protect. And it could be data about the action you want to do, view, edit, delete, or the risk associated with an action. Deleting is riskier than creating, for instance. And it can be contextual data, the IP of the device you're using, the type of device you're using, the time of day, so on and so forth. So I stole this slide from a previous presentation I did that was about going camping, which is why we have a cute little picture of someone fishing. But an example of a policy would be, a person can fish non-endangered species during daytime. By the way, I hate fishing, except when it's pH, in which case I love fishing, if they have a valid permit and they have not exceeded their daily quota. That's a good authorization policy. And then the question could be, can Joe, the teenager on vacation, fish trout in Glacier National Park at 2 p.m.? And the answer is probably no, because I'm guessing you can't fish in a national park. I said yes, I'm a very bad citizen here. Okay, why should you care? You've all heard of OWASP. They have 2 lists that are worth looking at. There's a 2017 list for the top 10 OWASP security threats, and then there's a 2021 list specifically for API. On both lists, the #1 issue is broken access control. So there's 2 terms you want to remember here. BOLA, broken object level access, and then the other one is IDOR, indirect object reference. Believe it or not, in API land, when you have an API that says, /bank/account/123, there have been APIs that have been found with vulnerabilities where you can modify the account number and see someone else's account number. And I'm saying account, I'm not saying it happened in banking, but it happens in other APIs, hopefully not in banking. So you got to worry about these. And if you had an authorization engine sitting in there and an enforcement point sitting in the API flow, if your API implementation is flawed, the authorization piece will pick it up and make sure that you only get access to what you're supposed to see. Okay. Some of the use cases that you can do with externalized authorization and ABAC. #1, you can do access delegation. So a great example would be if you have you bank with a bank, and by default you can view your own bank accounts, and then your senior parents move into a care home and they're not capable of doing online banking, then there could be a policy there that says, hey, you can view your own bank accounts, and you can view bank accounts for people you care for, your kids under 18, and your senior parents, as long as they're on the list, right? So it enables new use cases. By the way, side effect of this, it reduces what is sometimes known as API explosion. API explosion is that whole idea that to cater to new use cases, you have to expose a new endpoint. If you decouple authorization from the application logic, then you can have the APIs or the applications focus on the core features, access the account, and then you can let the authorization focus on the authorization use cases, accessing one's own account, accessing a parent's bank account, accessing your child's bank account, so on and so forth. You can do relationships, like I mentioned before, indirect relationships or direct relationships. So if I own a document, I can view it. If the document is in the same department, I can view it. I can do risk-based. If I'm right now checking my account balance in Carlsbad, California, and 5 minutes later I'm moving money from Stockholm, Sweden, there's something fishy going on, right? So you might want to prevent that. You can do user experience. So user experience is enabling cool things you couldn't do in the past thanks to authorization. So that's no longer necessarily a security aspect, but it's more about enabling. A great example would be, we're all old enough in this room, I think, to have known the days when medical records were just on paper, and if you wanted to get your medical results, you had to go to the doctor's office, and then the secretary would have a huge wall of manila folders behind them, and they'd pull one out. That was the access control, the physical access control in place. Well, today you can actually log into things like Epic to see your medical records, and we can make sure that the right access control is there to make sure you can only see your own medical records. Thanks. You can do contextual RBAC. So you have a role, great. RBAC doesn't go away, by the way. We build on RBAC when we do externalized authorization. But now you could say, oh, yeah, you're a manager from 9 to 5, but guess what? After 5, you're not a manager anymore. Or you're a manager in the context of a given project or a given store, but not a manager as a whole. So context matters. And then you could have exception handling as well. As a whole, as a manager, you can view certain data. But you can't view data if you move from, say, the US to Canada because you're a US-only company, as an example. Not picking on Canada. They have rats, but not in Alberta. All right, so quick note. Like I said, there's different ways of doing authorization. One such way that I work with a lot is a language called the abbreviated language for authorization. As you might have seen on the standard slide that I had earlier, it's something that we came out with in 2014. It's a very lightweight language to write policies. There are many languages, by the way, to write authorization policies. There's Rego by Open Policy Agent. Cerbos have their own language. Signal have their own language. There's Zackwell, of course. There's Alpha. There's Cedar by AWS. So there's a bunch of languages, right? So you can compare them. They're more or less all equivalent. They have their pros and their cons. The point is, though, the key benefit of having a language is that you can actually compare what you wrote in your policy with the plain old English requirement to begin with. So policy-driven authorization is a really, really cool feature in that way. This is what a policy would look like in Alpha. So there's a structure to it. Here what I'm saying is I will have a policy set that applies to records only, and then within that policy set, I'm going to have a policy that applies to viewing records, and within the view policy, I have a policy that applies to managers. So in other words here, a manager can view a record, and then there's, a manager can view a record as a whole, and then owners can view records too, regardless of role, okay? If you want to see more Alpha policies, we do have a website called alpha.guide where you can go check it out. Has a bunch more examples. Here's what it looks like if you visualize a policy. Don't think for a minute that because you've written a policy in text that you can't visualize it. It's actually kind of cool because you can do, there's a lot of people now that do policy as code or everything as code. So if you want to write a policy in text, you can. If you want to visualize a policy graphically, you can too. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. You could also do that with XML back in the day, by the way, with XSLT, for anyone who likes XSLT. Okay. Authorization done well, going back to Andrew's presentation this morning and Ian's presentation this morning, can help you enable zero trust. Sometimes my marketing team will say, oh, we are zero trust. Nah, we're a building block of zero trust. But there's so many other elements. And don't drink the Kool-Aid of a vendor that says we will turn on zero trust for you. That's just not true, right? I fully agree with what Andrew said earlier. But it does help you enable zero trust, especially with the continuous access. So some of the benefits to wrap it up on authorization. Number one, enhanced security, better security, because you see the security. It's no longer in code deep down in your app. You no longer have doubts about what's happening or not happening. Number two, you can take your policy, and turn around and give it to the auditors. You can take your audit logs too and prove what has happened or not happened. You can also analyze those logs and say, hey, hang on a minute, this person has been trying to access data for the past 5 minutes, and they're getting deny. Maybe they're a bad actor. Number three, increase speed. If your developers don't have to reinvent the authorization wheel, then they'll be able to work on features that really matter to your customers. Number four, user experience. I touched on that. You can deliver a better product. 5, you can adapt more quickly. You can change your use cases. The banking example about being able to view one's own accounts is true, and then being able to view your parents' accounts, that's a huge thing if that could actually work out of the box. And lastly, I think it's cheaper to do externalized authorization because you decouple things. It's very much in the trend of everything we've been doing in software development for the past 10 years with microservices, with getting everything much smaller. And on that note, with a minute to spare, and maybe a couple minutes for questions, thank you. We're going to have an hour's worth of a panel on authorization, so you can save the questions for then if you want to do that.
If you want questions, you can use the microphone there. Please download the app so you can leave comments, and there are some questions that you can put on the app. Make sure also you do session evaluation. So if you have questions, go ahead and ask. Otherwise, we'll take 5 minutes break, and then we will have a panel.
All right, thank you.